Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are embarking on a deep dive into one of history's most compelling figures, but also one of its most, well, historically ambiguous. We're talking about a man whose name has echoed for 2,000 years, a man who went from a Thracian gladiator to a global icon of resistance, Spartacus.
It's just a spectacular story to break down. We've got a fantastic stack of sources here. The classical accounts, of course, but also modern scholarship and analyses of his legacy.
And that's what we want to do, right? Use these sources to triangulate what we can know about the actual man, Spartacus.
Exactly. To examine the sheer terror he inspired in Rome during the war he led, the Third Servile War. And also, to critically assess why his story has been repurposed by everyone from Karl Marx to Soviet sports clubs.
Our mission today is a rigorous one, then. We want to understand the man who terrified the world's only superpower, analyze the military genius he showed with this improvised army of 70,000 escaped slaves. And most importantly, I think, we have to confront the biggest historical challenge right up front. The immense gap between the myth we all know and the man the Romans actually wrote about.
Yes.
And you really have to get this to understand why a conflict that ended in the brutal crucifixion of 6,000 people became known, to some, as the only just war in history.
And we absolutely have to start with that challenge because Spartacus is, globally famous, but he exists almost entirely in a historical shadow. The moment you decide to study him, you have to accept that you're studying Roman perception, not the man himself.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the severe problem of the sources. We're talking about an event that ripped through Italy in 73 BC, right at the tail end of the Roman Republic, probably its most chaotic era. But our main historical anchors, the narratives we really rely on, they were written a century or more later. That's a huge time lapse.
It's an enormous chasm. And that distance in time, in political context, it fundamentally biases our view. Our two primary accounts are from Plutarch and Appian. Plutarch wrote his life of Crassus in the early 2nd century AD. Appian wrote his civil wars a little later. Both of these men were Greeks, writing long after the fact, and they were writing under the stability of the Roman Empire.
So they're looking back at the chaotic final decades of the Republic, but from the comfort of the imperial era. How does that change their perspective on something as terrifying as a massive slave revolt?
It lets them inject moralizing elements, maybe political lessons that might not have been there in the original accounts. They're reconstructing a time of immense instability, civil war, economic upheaval, the very chaos that allowed Spartacus to thrive, but from a position of, relative security.
Okay.
And this is the most critical point for anyone diving into this. Not one surviving source was written by an eyewitness. We have no diaries, no battle plans, no manifestos from Spartacus or his lieutenants.
And certainly nothing from the enslaved people themselves.
Precisely. The voices of the oppressed were completely, utterly silenced. Everything we read is filtered through the lens of Roman officials, generals, or historians who were sympathetic to Rome's need for order.
So we can say what the Romans thought Spartacus wanted.
But we can't know his true objective. That bias is everything.
Which makes the few specific details we do have about his early life even more important, even if they're a little contradictory. So what do we actually know about Spartacus the man before he became, the legend?
Okay, so all sources agree he was a Thracian by birth. He came from an area that today would be near the Strymon River in modern Bulgaria. Plutarch specifically calls him a Thracian of nomadic stock, which might be a reference to the Mede tribe.
And that immediately gives him a background that's not Roman, not Italian. It suggests a certain resilience, a familiarity with hardship, and maybe crucially, fighting outside of standard Roman discipline.
Absolutely. And this is where his military background is so key. Appian says he had once served as a soldier with the Romans, but had since been a prisoner and sold for a gladiator.
Florus says something similar, right? A mercenary.
Yes, Florus calls him a Thracian mercenary who became a Roman soldier, then deserted, was enslaved, and then chosen to be a gladiator because of his strength. So whether he was a mercenary, an auxiliary, or a deserter, the bottom line is Spartacus was a man who understood Roman military tactics.
And their weaknesses.
That experience is fundamental to everything that happens next.
It also humanizes him a bit. I was struck by the fact that Plutarch goes out of his way to mention Spartacus's wife.
He does. He notes that his wife, who he describes as a prophetess of the Mede tribe, was enslaved right alongside him. That small detail suggests he might have been a man of some standing in his own community.
He wasn't just a random peasant.
Right. He brought a spiritual figure with him into the crucible of Roman slavery.
And that crucible was the gladiatorial school, the Ludus near Capua, owned by a man named Lentulus Batiatus, and this is where the spark ignites in 73 BC.
Correct. We even know his fighting style. He was being trained as a murmillo.
Murmillo. What does that entail?
Think heavyweight gladiator. Heavily armed, heavily armored. He would have carried a large oblong shield, a scutum, and a short, straight sword called a gladius. That training, which was meant for public slaughter, ironically gave them the perfect foundation for structured combat.
And the escape itself? It's just this perfect story of desperation meeting audacity. It wasn't some grand plan with stockpile weapons, was it?
Not at all. In 73 BC, the plot involved about 70, maybe 78 slaves. And when their plan was discovered, they didn't have swords or spears. They had to grab whatever was in the kitchen choppers, spits, kitchen knives.
70 men, armed with basically large kitchen cutlery, fighting their way out of a professional death school. That says everything about their commitment.
It does. They fight their way out, and then, crucially, they manage to intercept some wagons full of actual gladiatorial weapons and armor.
So they get a real upgrade.
A huge upgrade. They defeat the local soldiers sent after them, and then they make their first really strategic move. They retreat to a strongly defensible, seemingly impregnable position on Mount Vesuvius.
That choice of terrain shows his tactical mind immediately. And once they're there, this leadership structure emerges. We hear about Spartacus and two Gauls, Crixus and Enomus.
Yes, and we need to be a little critical of how the Romans portray this. Roman writers, being intensely hierarchical, they tend to elevate Spartacus as the singular genius. Crixus and Enomus are often reduced to, subordinates or dissenting voices.
But it was probably more of a coalition.
Almost certainly. It was a mixed group of Thracians, Gauls, and others. The leadership was likely more decentralized, reflecting those ethnic loyalties, all just united under this banner of rebellion. Enomus, by the way, seems to have died pretty early on in the fighting.
So if they were such a mixed group, what was it about Spartacus that made the others, especially these Gallic warriors, accept his overall command?
It had to be his competence, his force of will. He quickly proved to be the most capable tactician. And this becomes crystal clear in how the Romans reacted, or rather, how they failed to react.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Roman authorities, they're busy fighting wars elsewhere, and they just dismiss this whole thing. And that initial Roman arrogance, it gave the rebellion the breathing room it desperately needed to grow.
They profoundly underestimated the threat. You have to remember the context. Rome's best legions, its top commanders, they were all overseas. They were fighting the Third Mithridatic War in the East and still dealing with a huge revolt in Hispania.
So a slave uprising in Italy, that's just a local problem.
Exactly. They saw it as a policing matter, a job for the local magistrates, not a full-scale war requiring consular legions.
So they don't send a consul. They send a praetor, a man named Gaius Claudius Glaber, with a hastily assembled militia.
Right.
And Glaber's defeat at Vesuvius is the moment that tells you exactly who Spartacus was as a military leader.
Oh, it's a classic, a textbook example of superior thinking defeating superior numbers. Glaber gets to Vesuvius, and he does the obvious Roman thing. Yeah. He lays siege, he blocks off the main known paths down the mountain, assuming he can just starve them out.
Makes sense.
But he completely discounts the steep, unfortified side of the volcano,
which Spartacus uses brilliantly. It shows his army understood improvisation better than the Romans understood topography.
Exactly. Spartacus's forces use ropes, and not military-grade ropes, but ropes they made from wild vines they gathered and twisted together on the mountainside.
Wow.
And with these, they climb down the steep, almost sheer, unfortified cliff face. It's an incredible feat of engineering and just sheer desperation. They get completely behind the Roman camp and attack from the rear.
Total surprise.
Complete surprise. They overwhelm the mostly untrained militia. And that single tactical victory just changes everything. It screams, this is not a mob of runaway slaves. This is an organized military force led by a genius.
And they followed that up by routing another praetor's forces. The news of these victories must have been a massive recruiting magnet.
It was explosive. The wins legitimized the revolt. Suddenly, slaves, shepherds, rural laborers, they're all flocking to the banner. The sources say the army swelled dramatically, reaching an estimated 70,000 people at its peak.
70,000. That is a massive, spontaneous army operating across Italy. How on earth did they organize that? And how did they maintain military effectiveness when they were made up of so many different groups?
I think it comes down to two crucial factors that people often overlook. First, most of the recruits were rural slaves, the ones working the brutal latifundia, the largest states.
So they were already hardened.
Exactly. They were already used to brutal physical labor, long marches, and surviving in the wild. They were far better prepared for campaigning than, say, urban household slaves.
So their entire life was already a form of extreme training.
Precisely. The second factor is the presence of legion veterans in their ranks. The Republic had just finished the Social War, a massive conflict where Rome fought its Italian allies.
Ah, okay.
So a lot of former soldiers, allies, mercenaries, people sold into slavery after the conflict, they had institutional knowledge of Roman discipline, formations, logistics.
That's the game changer. So Spartacus, a former soldier himself, now has a core of experienced people who can translate his tactics into workable structures for 70,000 people. And they spend the winter of 73, 72 BC doing what?
Not resting. They were actively training, arming, and equipping all these new recruits. They expanded their raids, securing supplies from wealthy towns like Nola and Thurii. And the spread of these raids shows they were already operating in two main independent groups, commanded by Spartacus and Crixus. That points to complex logistics.
By the spring of 72 BC, the Senate finally has to admit this is a full-blown war, the Third Servile War. They stop sending militias, and they dispatch the highest commanders they have available. 2 consuls, each with 2 legions.
This was the official recognition of failure. This was the best the Republic could muster at the time. But the initial results were actually disastrous for the rebels.
Right, Crixus's group is defeated.
Yes. The consuls catch Crixus's group, maybe 30,000 men, near Mount Garganus, and Crixus is defeated and killed.
That must have been a crushing blow. Losing a key leader, losing that many men. The Romans must have thought the rebellion would just collapse.
They absolutely did. But this is where you see the genius of Spartacus. Instead of collapsing, he takes the strategic initiative. He then defeats the combined consular legions when they link up, turning a Roman victory into yet another massive humiliation.
Unbelievable.
The Roman accounts disagree on the exact details, but the final result is undeniable. The Republic had been militarily humiliated by a former gladiator.
So after this huge success, they've beaten the consuls, they've basically cleared a path north over the Alps, out of Italy, and then they turn south again. This turn south is one of the biggest mysteries of the whole war, isn't it?
It is the central question. Why abandon what looks like freedom and march back into the heart of Italy, potentially trapping yourself?
And the sources just don't agree.
They're completely divided. Plutarch is the main one who argues Spartacus's goal was always escape. He wanted to get his people over the Alps and back to their homelands in Gaul or Thrace. If that's true, the turn south is just. It's an inexplicable blunder.
But then you have Appian and Florus who suggest something much bigger.
Exactly. They imply he wanted to march on Rome itself. Now, a direct assault seems suicidal, but the turn south could be seen as a way to, seize more plunder, secure supplies for the winter, maybe gain some political leverage before trying to leave.
It also seems likely the army itself wasn't unified. Didn't Crixus's faction, the Gauls and Germans, want to stay and plunder Italy?
That's a key part of the modern analysis, this internal friction. Spartacus's faction perhaps wanting a strategic retreat, and the Gallic and Germanic faction being more motivated by revenge and wealth. That could have been the deciding factor. Spartacus might have been forced south by pressure from within his own ranks.
Which makes the army less of a unified force and more of a fragile coalition. But whatever the reason, that decision to stay in Italy sealed their fate, because it forced Rome to escalate. They finally bring in the big guns. Marcus Licinius Crassus,
the wealthiest man in Rome. He volunteers for the command, seeing it as a massive political opportunity. And the Senate gives him an enormous force. 8 legions. You're talking about upwards of 40,000 trained Roman soldiers.
And Crassus sees right away that the problem isn't just Spartacus, it's the morale of the Roman army after all these defeats. So to fix that, he brings back a punishment so terrifying, we still talk about it. Decimation.
It's a truly chilling detail. Decimation had been rarely used. It involves executing 1/10 of a unit that performed poorly. The soldiers were chosen by lot and then beaten or stoned to death by their own comrades.
Why? Why do that to your own men?
Because the Roman troops were no longer afraid of the slave army. They had low morale. They were disobedient. Crassus's goal was pure psychological warfare. He had to make absolutely sure his soldiers were more afraid of him than their enemy.
And that brutality. It worked.
It did. After that, Crassus's legions operated with this new, terrifying discipline. He gains the upper hand and starts pushing Spartacus further and further south toward the toe of Italy, a place called Rhegium.
Spartacus must have seen he was being driven into a trap. He was aiming for Sicily, right? hoping to stir up more revolts there.
He was desperately trying to get off the peninsula. Plutarch says he made a deal with Cilician pirates to ferry 2,000 of his men across the Strait of Messina to Sicily.
But the pirates, being pirates,
They delivered a crippling betrayal. They took the payment, probably a massive amount of plundered gold and silver, and then they just sailed away. They abandoned the rebels completely.
which left Spartacus's best escape route gone.
Totally gone. And Crassus, who was a master of logistics, immediately capitalized. He built this massive system of fortifications across the entire isthmus at Rhegium, a 12-mile-long ditch and a rampart sea to sea.
So he just trapped the entire rebel army.
Completely cut them off, besieged them, started starving them out.
It seems like a perfect slow-motion victory for Crassus. But then Roman politics throws a wrench in the works. Crassus suddenly has to speed things up.
That speed comes from his old rival, Pompey the Great. Pompey's legions are returning from Hispania, and the Senate, maybe not fully trusting Crassus, orders Pompey south to help out.
And Crassus knows what that means.
He knows Pompey might sweep in, fight one battle, and steal all the credit. So, fearing that political humiliation, he rejects Spartacus's desperate attempts to negotiate a truce. He needs a quick, decisive battle.
And Spartacus is forced into one last desperate move.
He manages to break through Crassus's fortifications, takes heavy losses, and makes a break for Brundusium on the eastern coast, probably hoping to find ships. But during that march, the discipline of the rebel army finally breaks.
They start splintering.
Exactly. Smaller groups break off, engage the legions on their own. It fragments the army. It forces Spartacus to turn his entire remaining force around for one final unified stand.
Which brings them to that last crushing battle in 71 BC near the Sele River.
All the sources agree it was a complete rout. The rebels were annihilated. And yet, for all the detail, the fate of the leader himself remains this huge historical mystery. Plutarch, Appian, Florus, they all say Spartacus died fighting bravely.
What?
But Appian explicitly says his body was never found.
The vanished body of the rebel leader. That absence is almost as powerful as his actions because it leaves the door open for mythology. But the vengeance Rome took was terrifyingly real. It was a message.
Unparalleled brutality. Crassus rounded up 6,000 captured survivors and ordered them crucified. They lined the Appian Way, the main road south from Rome, all the way back to Capua, where it all began.
A spectacle of death stretching over 100 miles.
A gruesome warning meant to ensure no one ever forgot the price of rebellion.
It's a chilling image, and it really shows how deeply Spartacus had terrified the Republic. Which brings us really to the core of this deep dive. With this historical vacuum, this uncertainty about his motives, how did his memory become such a potent, adaptable symbol?
Well, that mystery of the turn south is directly linked to the debate on his motives. And that debate feeds the legend. You have Plutarch saying he just wanted to escape, and Appian and Florus suggesting he might have aimed for Rome. That vacuum allows for projection.
And what we as modern listeners often assume, based on the narrative, is that he wanted to abolish slavery itself.
That's the powerful modern myth. But this is the crucial historical point we have to make. The ancient sources do not support the idea that Spartacus aimed to reform Roman society or abolish slavery as an institution.
Wait, so if he wasn't a proto-abolitionist, what do the sources actually suggest his goal was?
The goal, based on his actions, plundering, moving, avoiding long sieges, it seems to have been about survival, getting material gain for his followers, and securing their personal freedom by getting out of Italy.
But he freed thousands of slaves.
He freed rural slaves who were easy to extract and were good fighters, but he seems to have consciously avoided recruiting the more numerous urban slaves. If your goal is total revolution, would you want to destabilize the cities? But if your main goal is to form a mobile, effective army that can cross the Alps, recruiting thousands of household cooks and tutors would just be a logistical nightmare. The absence of abolition as a stated goal in any classical account is very telling. It suggests the legend that grew up around him completely eclipsed his actual, probably more practical objectives.
So the legend had to create a revolutionary out of a resourceful gladiator. And that legend became incredibly potent in the modern era, especially for communists and socialists.
Oh, his story was perfect for 19th and 20th century political philosophy. The enslaved worker rising up against the wealthy landowning oligarchy, Karl Marx was utterly captivated. He called Spartacus the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history, a real representative of the ancient proletariat.
That is a staggering leap. From a Thracian mercenary fighting for his life to the ancient symbol of the global working class. That political repurposing is what made him immortal.
It truly is. And the symbols spread everywhere. In the 18th century, he inspired Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. Louverture was called the Black Spartacus.
And in 20th century Germany,
He inspired the German Spartacus League, founded by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They were the forerunners of the German Communist Party, and their failed revolution in 1919 is known as the Spartacist Uprising. His name just became a shorthand for violent resistance.
but the legacy wasn't just political, it became institutionalized in sports and culture, especially in the Soviet bloc.
This is where his name becomes pervasive in Eastern Europe. The Spartakiad was the massive Soviet version of the Olympics, meant to counter the so-called bourgeois nature of the real games.
So they turned the revolutionary into a symbol of collective physical prowess and national unity, which is a fascinating rebranding of a man who fought for individual freedom from the state.
It is, and that name is still everywhere in sports clubs today. FC Spartak Moscow, one of Russia's biggest football clubs. HC Spartak Moscow. In ice hockey, you find Spartak clubs all over Ukraine, Bulgaria, Slovakia. The name just signifies strength and defiance.
And for most of us in the West, we probably know the name from the 1960 Kirk Douglas movie.
The Stanley Kubrick film, yeah. And that film is a perfect example of the legend eclipsing the history. It heavily romanticized the idea of a fight for universal abolition, which fit perfectly with Cold War liberal ideals.
So really, what does this all mean for us today? The fact that his history is so uncertain, we don't know his true motivation, we don't know where his body is, that allows his story to be endlessly repurposed. He's a blank canvas for resistance.
That is the ultimate takeaway. The historical man was a brilliant, pragmatic military leader who terrified Rome. He forced the Republic to deploy its wealthiest general and use its most brutal tactic decimation, all to stop a rebellion that started with 70 guys and some kitchen knives. The sheer extremes Rome went to tells you everything about the threat he posed.
And maybe the real lingering tragedy here is the silence. We are left only with the Roman accounts, the accounts of the victors. The philosopher Voltaire once described the Third Servile War as the only just war in history.
And if you accept that, you have to then wrestle with the painful irony that the full history of this only just war is told entirely by the side that waged the unjust war against it.
We're just left to wonder what the real motivation was, what a true slave commonwealth might have looked like if the voices of Spartacus, Crixus, and the 70,000 who followed them had survived, instead of being extinguished on the Appian Way. It's a powerful, unsettling thought. We really encourage you to look up those cultural references, especially the Soviet-era sports connections. The depth of the legacy is incredible.
Dive deeper into those sources yourself.
That was the deep dive. We'll see you next time.